In this segment, we're going to be continuing our discussion about the universal patterns of change. In the previous section, we talked about the very first pattern, and that was the value change. So in this segment, we're going to begin with a very, very important change, and that is identity change. So perhaps the best way to begin talking about that is by asking this very basic question. Ask yourself, who am I? And the first answer probably in most cases is going to be a sexist one. It's going to be based on your gender. You would say, I'm a male, I'm a female. But then I think very quickly the answer probably will be for most of you that I am an American. Now I want you to realize that this is a pretty modern answer. A few generations back, it would have been something like, I'm an Irishman, I'm Italian, I'm a Frenchman, etc., or I'm a Japanese, and so forth. And therefore, you could see that very quickly this point of identity relates to your sense of nationality. Political identity is important because it is a key to political behavior. It determines one's political behavior, and whether or not, and this is an important one, that political behavior is going to be nationalistic one. So the issue of political identity is really central to the kind of concerns we have in this course. And you can think of political identity as being a critical factor in the area in terms of the conflicts there exist, whether it's intrastate or interstate conflict. That's one of the key points. The second related point is about the historical roots of political identity. And in that context, it's worth remembering that the episodes of imperialism in the Middle East, most of it took shape, most of it occurred before the people of that area had become nations. Remember, a good part of the area in the Middle East was under the suzerainty of the Ottoman Empire. So it really wasn't up until about the 20th century that you begin to see these new identities forming. Prior to the mid-20th century, the kind of identity that people had was best characterized as parochial. The identity was a parochial one. So what does that mean? Well, at the time when parochial identity prevailed, most people in the Middle East would have answered the question of who am I by basically referring to their villages, to their extended family, to their clans. And you may recall the anecdote that I mentioned to you early on when we were talking about Iran and the villages in Iran and their thinking. People really were not aware of much beyond their villages. And therefore, the identity was limited to that extended family. So this is a critical thing to remember. And parochial identity is a defining characteristic of what we have called pre-mass politics. This, of course, is not the case today. And today, the identities have dramatically changed, and for each country, obviously, we're going to discuss the change process when we deal with each of these countries. But the fact that it has occurred since the mid-20th century, what it suggests is that it was a very, very rapid pace of change taking place. And also remember that these are universal patterns. We, the Europeans, the Americans, went through this process, and now the Middle Easterners have also gone through it. Again, identity change is a big change. And as we said, identity change is the basis for answering that critical question, who am I? And in answering that question, the change goes from what we call parochial identity toward a larger community. So the change goes in the direction of a much larger community than your clan, than your extended family, than your village. And in many cases, that larger community happens to be a nation. And if that happens, in other words, if your identity switches over from your village to this larger community we call the nation, then you have to think in terms of expression of that identity and that attachment to this larger community in terms that we call nationalism. Nationalism really denotes a terrifically important phenomena with profound implication as far as the politics of a region is concerned. So to better understand this process of identity change and to be able to understand what nationalism really entails, I need to first go through a few definitions so that we know what a nation is, what a nation state is, what is nationalism. So let me begin with some definitions. The first one that I want to begin with is a definition of a nation. What is a nation? It really is reflection of the most intense identity one would have for a large group of individuals who believe that their community has a right to establish a state governmental organization, and that state governmental organization should gain world recognition and be regarded as a sovereign, independent state. So that gives you a clue as to what a nation is in the eye of the people who see themselves belonging to that larger community. So as you can see from the slide, it refers to a large group of individuals who identify intensely. Later on, I will explain just how intensely this identity has to be, this attachment has to be. And it's with a community which they believe deserve and is capable. That's also an important point. You may think you deserve it, but you may lack the requisite for achieving it. You have to be capable of defending independent statehood. So that community is typically referred to as a nation. The second definition that I would like to elaborate on is the definition of nationalism. Soon after the French Revolutions, astute political observer began to note something along the following, and that was when a large group of people come to believe that they are part of a community called a nation, which has a right to be organized as an independent state, and these people are willing to grant to that community a loyalty of primary intensity. I will unpack that. Essentially what that means, willing to risk their lives. These people tend to behave in a manner that we have come to think of as nationalistic. So when you want to unpack the definition of nationalism, there are three critical conditions that are kind of hidden in this definition. The first one is the size. It's got to be a large population, and large means several millions. Now, if you technically look for a nation, small nation that is very nationalistic as well, the smallest you can come up with is going to be Iceland, about 230,000. But that is an exception. For the most part, unless you're pretty large, several millions, defending independent statehood, creating a necessary economy that will provide an acceptable level of, acceptable living standards is not going to be possible. So one of the issues is the size of the population. That's going to create a nation. You have to have a certain minimum size of several millions. The second part of that definition is that belief. The belief that the goal of sovereign independence for the state is rightful, they deserve it, and also that copula and is very important, it's achievable. For example, if you compare the Kurds with Assyrians, you will see both really believe that they have this rightful right to nationhood. But the Kurds believe it is achievable, but if you ask Assyrians, is it likely to occur? They will tell you no. They just don't have the size and they won't be able to defend independent statehood. And then finally, the third element, again hidden in this definition, is the first intensity loyalty to the nation organized as a state. What that really means is this: when the chips are down, are you willing to sacrifice a lot, including, if necessary, your own life for the state? If the answer is yes, then you are a nationalistic person. If the answer is no, then you're not nationalistic. So, going back to the definition of nationalism, because as I said, this is a very, very important concept. Whenever these three conditions are present, one can expect the nationalistic behavior as we have defined it is likely to occur among that portion of the population who intensely identifies with the nation. Now, there are other factors, I'm just focusing on a few of them. There are other factors affecting one's predisposition to behave nationalistically. Had this been a course, let's say, on nationalism, I would have listed several factors, including how extensive is mass political participation in political life. I would also list the capability of people to defend independence and to also achieve acceptably high level of standards of living. For example, that's one of the issues that confronts Quebec. Every time it tries to cede from Canada, every study indicates that if they become independent, the standards of living is going to decline. So even though the population seems very desirous of independence, the cost seems too high to pay for it. And then the third factor would be the sense that the community is unique and has a common history and, even more important, expectation of a common future, a shared destiny, so to speak. That's very important. So Iceland would really fit that model. They're very unique and expectation of a shared future or common future. And then finally, the homogeneity of community is very important because the more homogeneous, the easier it is for people's identity to converge. The more heterogeneous, the more challenging that would be. So for example, when you compare Israel with Iraq, you will see on those last two a unique history and a homogeneity of population, at least for the Jewish part of the state of Israel. About 20% are Arabs. That is a major plus and a major advantage for Israel. So we have dealt with two very important definitions, one of them being nation, the other one being nationalism. Now I want to add two more definitions. So these will be the kind of a building blocks we will use to understand the countries that we're going to be studying. My next definition is that of a nation state. What is a nation state in the light of what I have said? And the answer, at least the one I suggest, is this. A nation state, the notion of state really refers to a state governmental organization. It's the state structure, really, which serves the identity community, the nation. In other words, the state is in the service of the nation. And in that context, this is a very, very important element, because when you contrast that with the opposite of nation-state, well, let me go back, point out that the importance of this, in addition to its contrast with the non-nation state that I'll talk briefly, from our perspective, from the Western perspective, it is a basic unit of analysis in international politics. When you study international politics, nation-state is the basic unit of analysis. In other words, we treat every country as if they were nation-state. Now, going back to my other point about the contrast with non-nation state, so let's look at the non-nation state. Notice the definition. A non-nation state also has a governmental organization, but notice the difference with the nation state. It serves a conglomeration of identity communities, not one, several. And these various communities together do not constitute a single encompassing identity. So a non-nation state or multinational state sometimes are those that the state does not necessarily coincide with a single national identity. In fact, in most cases, they do not. Now, here's a big surprise. Ask yourself, how many states in the world, over nearly 200 states that we have in the world, official states, how many are nation states and how many are non-nation states? The answer is the number of true nation states may not exceed about 30. Many of them happen to be located in Europe, United States, and the Western Hemisphere. By contrast, as many as 70 or 80 states really are non-nation state on the basis of a definition that I've talked about. And in the Middle East, we got plenty of them. Look at Lebanon. Look at how many different identity communities exist there. And when you think of the state government, it's pathetic. And there's not one encompassing identity that it would serve. Look at Iraq. You got Arabs and the Kurds. You got sectarian divide between the Shiites and the Sunnis. And Iraq really is non-nation state. Or look at Syria. Syria is a non-nation state with Alawite ruling over the Sunnis and a host of other sectarian minorities, including the Christians and the Druze and so forth. Or look at Afghanistan, a multinational state. In fact, the best recent example of a non-nation state is the former Soviet Union. Recall that was a motley empire holding 15 empires, very diverse, very different in composition, very different in identities, holding them together by sheer force. And when the force was removed, it disintegrated very rapidly. So much so that we didn't know how to even react. Certainly wasn't part of our prediction. So here's a good lesson for you. The Cold War, that ominous war, was a conflict between a great nation state, the United States, and a very weak non-nation state, the Soviet Union. So that shouldn't surprise you that in that conflict, if you were to predict the outcome of the conflict, who would survive and who would win. But most of the theories that we have, unfortunately, most of the theories of development, most of the theories of international relations don't talk about non-nation states. The overwhelming majority of political entities in the world. Instead, we treat every country as if they were nation states. that is another example of what I have called Amero-Eurocentric theories of our country, because we take ourselves as an example and we project our nation statehood throughout the whole region.